Today we're going to be looking at how I create the Fate collection, which is a compact tarot mat. For an extended ASMR version of this video, you'll find a link in the description to my second channel. Like most of my leather projects, it starts off with a side of natural veg tan shoulders, which is approximately 2.5 millimeters thick. I find this gives me a nice sense of rigidity when holding the pieces. It doesn't flop around, it's nice to work with. So here I have cut a strip from that leather, and now I'm just about to prepare the strip into little squares or smaller squares that I can use to cut out the final shapes from the leather. The aim being to have minimal wastage from the offcuts, although all the scraps that I do have, I do tend to save for either test pieces or to upcycle into something else. Now we're taking everything over to the 4-ton clicker press, which allows me to apply, well, 4 tons of pressure onto anything that I want. In this case, I'm using it on the custom-made dies that are specifically tailored to my designs. And here I'm lining that die on the leather, and I'm putting some pressure onto that die to cut through. That's always satisfying, being able to pop out those shapes once I've cut them out. And this is always important. I check through all of the shapes that I cut out afterwards to look for imperfections. So perhaps there's some scarring that I've missed that I'm not particularly happy with using. So in those cases, I will again use those for prototyping something else in the future. Or if I decide to, I can always go ahead and make the same product later and label them as seconds. As long as I try and recoup the costs on the materials, I generally tend to be quite happy with that. Now I'm laying out those leather pieces on my trusty piece of cardboard, ready to case. The term casing, in this case, let me just that twice, is to wet the leather and allow it to be a little bit more malleable to work with when I am stamping shapes into it. So I'm spraying it here with some water, and I will do that 2 or 3 times, allowing the water to soak in between each spray, and then I'll let that set for about 10 to 15 minutes before I go and work with it. So here it would have been about 15 minutes later once the water had soaked in, and this allows me to get my jigs. In this case, I'm using some right angle jigs to help hold things and align things. And I'm using a piece of card that helps me align where my brass stamps need to be placed. Before I was using the cardboard to do this, I was doing it the really long-winded way, which was like measuring it 500 times with a ruler all around the edges to make sure it was in the center. And then eventually I had the forethought to make this little thing. Now you'll watch me spin this piece of leather round, and that's because there's a slight flaw with my clicker press in that it's not perfectly perpendicular to the plate. So I think there's like a millimeter difference perhaps between the front and the back, so it doesn't apply even pressure. That's why I spin it around 180 degrees, just to ensure everything gets pressed down correctly. And I love the way that comes out. And this one is for the front. This is going to represent where the card placements are going to be, and then the laser etch designs sit inside of them. I think it's really important, with my designs at least, to have some sort of tactile feel with the different embossing and debossing that I do. It's far more satisfying to hold and work with, in my opinion. And then once I'm done, I'll put these on the drying rack before I move on to the next stage. Very frequently, it tends to be the next day that I'll move on to the next phase, unless I'm doing this first thing in the morning, and then I'll do something late at night, because I just want to make sure there's just like zero moisture in that leather. Okay, so the laser etching stage. So at this point, I place my piece of leather onto the grid in my laser cutter, and I have my design pre-loaded on my tablet. And this is really important now, just getting the laser aligned. This is one of those situations where a lot of work has already gone into preparing that piece of leather, and I don't want to make the mistake of having the leather be a bit wonky, for lack of a better word. It's happened to me a couple of times, and now I just check and check and check. I've sped the footage up here, but I think the entire process takes about 10 to 12 minutes off the top of my head. And then often I'll just work on something else in the background. And it's always satisfying to see how this comes out. I really, really like this design. Now, oiling's really important because of the casing, and what we've done with the leather so far has dried it out. This adds more moisture back into the leather and makes it more malleable, because what will happen is as the leather gets wet and dries, it'll become stiff, and it's not very nice to work with. And so allowing the oil to soak in both slightly darkens the leather, which gives it a nicer look than the way it is when I started off, and allows me to work with that leather much more easier, or much easier, I should say, especially when it comes to gluing the pieces together. And again, I will leave the oiled leather to soak in and do what it needs to do over a course of hours, or maybe even overnight. In fact, a lot of time in the process of doing leather crafting is lost to waiting for things to dry, whether that be oils or waiting for the moisture to dry from the leather, or waiting for the antiquing or dyeing or even the edging paint to dry. There's just loads of downtime where you can't really do anything, and you have to trust the process and allow things to take their time. Okay, so here I'm using water-based contact cement. I've tried a few so far, and this has been my favorite. The reason being is that it's really nice to work with. You're not fighting it. With some of the more chemical-based tarry-like glues, I find it clumps up very quickly, and it's not great to work with. It doesn't brush out properly, and sometimes you end up with thicker patches, which kind of like keep your leather separated because the clumps in the middle. But this water-based adhesive is far easier to work with. So what I'll tend to do is put a drop of glue on the sponge brush, and I'll work it into the leather until essentially the leather becomes dry and tacky. I found that if I put too much glue on the brush when I'm using it, it ends up flicking around all over the pieces of leather that's next to it or on the cutting board, and then you don't realize straight away. And this is the jig that I help line things up. I don't know if you've ever worked with contact cement before, but once you've touched the two pieces together, it's a nightmare trying to pry them apart. And this is the best way I've found so far that helps me line up the edges, because there's nothing worse than pressing two pieces together and realizing they're out of alignment. And then you have to really tear the two pieces apart, which kind of like ruins the surface of the leather because you see all these creases. But this works a treat. And then I'll take this back over to the clicker press, where I'll sandwich it between two pieces of leather to help protect it. And I'll apply those 4 tons of pressure onto the piece to help adhere the pieces together, because there's only so much that I can do by squeezing it in my hands. And this process also ensures that the leather piece is flat. For good measure, I'll then use these, I can't remember the name of them, they're like pliers. I've used a bit of leather on the ends just to make sure it doesn't leave any tool impressions on the leather. But I use this to ensure that the edges are completely pressed together, because if there's any separation, it makes the next few processes, the next few steps of the process much harder. So earlier I alluded to aligning the two pieces of leather together when gluing it. As much prep as I put into it, there's always going to be some misalignment, just ever so slightly. So this just ensures that the two pieces are nice and flush, ready for dyeing and painting. You've got to be careful not to put too much pressure on the sander, because it's really, really easy to over sand leather due to like how soft it is. This is one of my favorite tools, and one of my favorite steps in the process is being able to shave these off. And from a tactile point of view, it also gives it a nice rounded edge. I admit sometimes I like to play a game where I see if I can go all the way around the leather piece without having the little strip break off. Okay, here I have a marker pen. Like, you can buy these empty marker pens that you fill up yourself. I filled mine up with leather dye, and it is absolutely perfect for doing this kind of work. So here I've got my nice clean sanded edge, and I'm putting this I guess undercoat on the leather and allowing this leather to dry afterwards, because when you come to do the acrylic edge coat afterwards, if it's not perfect, you can see the very pale leather underneath. So this undercoat really helps to, I guess, hide those issues. Not that they come up much, but when you do see them, to me at least, they're quite glaring. So this is a nice protective step. Also, because the way the edges have been prepared, I know this won't come across in the video, but this marker pen filled with leather dye just glides right over the leather. It just feels like nice. So up until recently, I was using a hand applicator and dipping it into this bottle of edge coat that you see here. But I had imported recently this little tool, and it's like a massive version of the pen applicator. But rather than take the applicator to the leather, you're taking the leather over to the applicator. And I've not gotten to use it too much just yet, but as you'll see in this footage, the process of applying the edge coat is so much faster. With the pen, it's like a quill. You have to keep dipping and dipping and dipping. And this, it's just, the edge coat is always on this drum, and it's so easy to apply, and it leaves such an amazing coat, of which I will apply twice. So once I've done this, I'll set it aside for an hour or so just to settle, and then I'll go in with a final coat, and it leaves a really nice, smooth edge. I think it really finishes the piece. All right, and with everything now dry, it's now time to pack everything into the presentation box. So the presentation boxes I have custom made, and the inserts I actually make myself using the laser cutter. So I use a type of recyclable EVA foam, and I cut the shapes according to the pieces that I'm making, just to give it that really satisfying fit. And I think it really adds to the unboxing experience. But yes, that's how I make my small tarot mat, the Fate edition.